There are places in the north where silence becomes a presence, where the cold does not simply chill the skin, but occupies the air, like something watching. In the winter of 1979, a meteorological research outpost nestled deep within the Northern Territories recorded its final transmission on the evening of February 9th. The outpost, designated Station 37, had been operational for 11 months. It was staffed by a rotating team of atmospheric scientists tasked with monitoring upper-altitude wind patterns and recording temperature anomalies across the boreal expanse. The facility was small, utilitarian, and isolated. It sat 43 kilometers from the nearest logging road, accessible only by floatplane in summer and ski-equipped aircraft in winter. On the night of February 9th, the voice of Maren Duclair, the station's senior meteorologist, was the last to be heard over the radio frequency reserved for routine status updates. Her final words were recorded by the regional monitoring station in Whitehorse. They were brief, calm, and unremarkable. She reported atmospheric pressure readings, confirmed fuel reserves for the week, and noted that visibility was deteriorating due to incoming snow. The transmission ended without incident. No distress signal was sent, no emergency protocol was initiated. When the next scheduled check-in failed to occur 3 days later, it was assumed that equipment failure or weather interference was to blame. Silence in the Northern Territories was not unusual. It was only when a supply flight attempted to land at Station 37 on February 20th that the true nature of the situation began to reveal itself. The pilot, an experienced bush aviator named Carl Henning, circled the site twice before deciding to land. The outpost appeared abandoned. The lights were off. No smoke rose from the chimney. No one emerged to signal him in. When Henning touched down on the frozen lake adjacent to the station, he found the main cabin door ajar. Inside, the interior was undisturbed. Instruments were still running. The radio was functional. Personal belongings remained in place. There were no signs of struggle, no indications of panic, no evidence that anything had gone wrong. But Maren Duclair and the 2 other researchers stationed with her were gone. This is the file of Station 37, a case of disappearance that unfolded slowly, quietly, and without explanation. A case that has remained open for more than 40 years, documented in fragmented reports, contradictory witness statements, and recordings that were never meant to be preserved. Station 37 was not the kind of place that invited long stays. It was functional, sparse, and designed to withstand the relentless cold of the northern winter. The main structure was a single-story prefabricated cabin measuring roughly 12 meters by 8. It housed the primary living quarters, a small kitchen area, a communications room, and a narrow hallway that connected to the observation chamber where meteorological instruments were monitored around the clock. The walls were insulated but thin. The windows were double-paned but small. Heat was provided by a diesel generator that hummed constantly, a low and steady sound that became part of the station's ambient noise. Outside, the landscape was a study in emptiness. The station sat on the southern shore of a glacial lake known locally as Morel Basin, though it had no official designation on most maps. The lake was roughly 3 kilometers wide at its longest point and frozen solid from October through late April. Beyond the lake, dense stands of black spruce stretched in every direction, broken only by occasional clearings where fire or wind had thinned the forest. To the north, a low ridge of bedrock rose above the tree line, its surface swept bare by wind. To the south, the forest deepened, becoming darker and more impenetrable. There were no roads, no trails, no settlements within a day's travel. The nearest human presence was a logging camp that had been abandoned the previous autumn, some 27 kilometers to the southeast. The station had been established as part of a broader atmospheric research initiative funded by a consortium of Canadian universities and government agencies. Its purpose was to collect data on high-altitude jet stream behavior and temperature inversion layers that occurred with unusual frequency in this region. The work was tedious, repetitive and solitary. Each team stayed for periods ranging from 6 weeks to 4 months before being rotated out. Maren Duclair had been at Station 37 since late October. She was in her second rotation at the site, having spent the previous winter at a similar facility further east. She was known among her colleagues as thorough, disciplined, and unusually comfortable with isolation. Her academic background was in atmospheric physics, and she had published several papers on cold air mass formation in subarctic environments. Those who worked with her described her as reserved but not unfriendly, someone who preferred observation to conversation. She kept detailed logs, wrote methodically, and rarely deviated from protocol. The 2 other researchers stationed with her were Leonard Goss, a junior climatologist in his late 20s, and Simone Archambault, a data technician responsible for maintaining the station's recording equipment. Goss had arrived in mid-November. Archambault had joined the team in early January. The 3 of them worked in overlapping shifts, ensuring that at least one person was awake and monitoring instruments at all times. Communication with the outside world was limited. Radio transmissions occurred twice weekly, on Wednesdays and Saturdays, unless conditions required additional contact. Supply flights arrived every 3 to 4 weeks, weather permitting. Mail was infrequent. The isolation was deliberate. The station was designed to function independently, with minimal external interference. In the weeks leading up to February 9th, there had been no indication that anything was amiss. Routine transmissions were logged without incident. Weather conditions were typical for the season, harsh but not unusual. The most recent supply flight had occurred on January 27th, delivering fuel, food rations, and replacement parts for a malfunctioning pressure gauge. The pilot who made that delivery later stated that all 3 researchers appeared in good health and displayed no signs of distress. The station was operating normally. There were no complaints, no requests for early extraction, no expressions of concern. The last confirmed sighting of Maren Duclair occurred during the transmission on February 9th at approximately 7:15 in the evening. The recording of that transmission still exists, preserved in the archives of the Regional Monitoring Office. Her voice is clear, steady, and untroubled. She reports that barometric pressure has dropped to 982 millibars, notes a temperature reading of -31 degrees Celsius, and mentions that visibility is declining rapidly due to an incoming weather system. She confirms that the station has adequate fuel reserves for the next 10 days and states that the next scheduled transmission will occur on February 12th. The transmission lasts just under 3 minutes. There is no deviation from standard protocol, no unusual pauses, no background sounds that suggest anything out of the ordinary. When the transmission ends, Maren Duclair signs off with her station designation and the time. That was the last time her voice was heard. On February 12th, the scheduled check-in did not occur. The regional monitoring station in Whitehorse logged the absence but did not immediately escalate the situation. Equipment failures were common in remote outposts, particularly during severe weather. Radio silence lasting several days was not unprecedented. A notation was made in the log, and a follow-up attempt was scheduled for February 14th. When that attempt also failed to produce a response, a secondary protocol was initiated. A message was relayed to the administrative office overseeing the research program, and a decision was made to dispatch a supply flight ahead of schedule to confirm the station's status. Weather conditions delayed the flight for 6 days. It was not until February 20th that Carl Henning's aircraft touched down on the frozen surface of Morel Basin. Henning later described what he found in a formal statement given to the Administrative Review Board. He stated that he circled the station twice before landing, noting that no lights were visible and no smoke was rising from the exhaust vent of the heating system. He found this unusual but not alarming, as it was possible the generator had failed or the crew had temporarily shut down the system for maintenance. Upon landing, he taxied his aircraft to within 50 meters of the main cabin and shut down the engine. He waited for several minutes, expecting someone to emerge. When no one appeared, he exited the aircraft and approached the building on foot. The cabin door was slightly open, though not wide enough to suggest it had been forced. Henning knocked and called out. There was no response. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was cold, though not frozen. The generator was no longer running, and the heating system had shut down, but the residual warmth suggested it had been operational within the past day or two. The main room was orderly. Personal effects were present. A jacket hung on a hook near the door. Boots were lined up beneath a bench. The kitchen area showed no signs of a meal in progress, but dishes had been washed and stacked neatly beside the sink. In the communications room, Henning found the radio equipment powered down but undamaged. The logbook lay open on the desk. The final entry dated February 9th. It was written in Maren Duclair's handwriting and corresponded with the transmission recorded that evening. The sleeping quarters were similarly undisturbed. Beds were made. Clothing remained folded in storage bins. There were no signs of hurried departure, no indications that the occupants had packed or prepared to leave. Henning searched the perimeter of the station. He found no tracks in the snow, though this was not necessarily unusual given that fresh snowfall had occurred over the preceding days. He checked the fuel storage shed, the equipment cache, and the emergency supply locker. Everything appeared intact. There was no evidence of fire, flood, structural failure, or any other environmental hazard that might have forced an evacuation. Henning returned to his aircraft and radioed the regional monitoring station, reporting that the outpost was abandoned and that no personnel were present. He was instructed to remain on site until further instructions could be provided. He spent the next hour conducting a more thorough search, walking the perimeter of the frozen lake and examining the surrounding forest edge. He found nothing. No bodies, no signs of violence, no clues as to where 3 people might have gone or why they had left without taking their winter gear. When Henning departed later that afternoon, he left behind a situation that defied easy explanation. The formal investigation into the disappearance of Maren Duclair, Leonard Goss, and Simone Archambault began on February 23rd, when a search and rescue team was dispatched to Station 37. The team consisted of 6 members, including 2 experienced trackers, a medical officer, and a communications specialist. They arrived by helicopter and established a temporary base camp adjacent to the station. Their primary objective was to locate the missing researchers, or failing that, to determine what had happened to them. The search was conducted in expanding concentric circles, radiating outward from the station. Teams moved on foot and by snowmobile, covering the frozen lake, the surrounding forest, and the ridge to the north. They searched for tracks, clothing, equipment, or any other evidence that might indicate the direction in which the researchers had traveled. The weather was cold but clear, and visibility was good. Despite these favorable conditions, the search yielded almost nothing. On the second day, a set of faint depressions in the snow was discovered roughly 200 meters east of the station, near the edge of the forest. The depressions were irregular and partially obscured by wind-blown snow, making it difficult to determine whether they were footprints or natural formations. A tracker named David Ostergaard examined the site and concluded that the marks were consistent with human tracks, but he could not confirm this with certainty. The tracks, if they were tracks, led into the forest and disappeared after a short distance. No other traces were found in that area. The search expanded to cover a radius of 5 kilometers. Teams moved deeper into the forest, checking natural shelters, abandoned animal dens, and areas where someone suffering from hypothermia or disorientation might have sought refuge. They found nothing. No bodies, no campsites, no discarded items. On the fourth day, a secondary search was conducted of the station itself. Every room was examined in detail. Drawers were opened. Storage bins were inspected. The investigation team was looking for anything that might provide insight into the mental state of the missing researchers, or any indication that something unusual had occurred prior to their disappearance. The logbooks were collected and analyzed. Maren Duclair's entries were meticulous and unremarkable. She recorded atmospheric data, equipment maintenance notes, and brief observations about weather patterns. There were no personal reflections, no mentions of interpersonal conflict, and no indications of stress or concern. Leonard Goss had also kept a log, though his entries were less detailed. He documented his assigned tasks, noted instrument calibrations, and occasionally made comments about the monotony of the work. In one entry, dated January 28th, he wrote that he was looking forward to the end of his rotation, and mentioned that he found the isolation more challenging than he had anticipated. There was nothing in his words to suggest imminent danger. Simone Archambault's entries were brief and technical. She maintained a separate log for equipment performance, noting minor malfunctions and repairs. Her final entry, dated February 8th, recorded the replacement of a faulty voltage regulator in the communications array. She made no mention of anything out of the ordinary. One item discovered during the search drew particular attention. In the communications room, tucked beneath a stack of meteorological charts, investigators found a handwritten note on a small piece of paper. The note was undated and unsigned, consisting of a single sentence written in block letters. It read, "The trees are closer now." The handwriting was analyzed and compared to samples from all three researchers. The analysis was inconclusive. Some believed the handwriting matched Leonard Goss's style. Others argued it resembled Simone Archambault's. A third examiner suggested it might have been written by Maren Duclair. No consensus was reached. The meaning of the note was equally unclear. Some interpreted it as a reference to encroaching forest, perhaps indicating that snowdrifts or fallen trees had altered the station's immediate surroundings. Others suggested it might be a metaphorical statement, though what it was meant to signify remained a matter of speculation. The note was catalogued as evidence, but provided no definitive leads. The investigation team also examined the station's emergency protocols. All three researchers had been trained in wilderness survival and cold weather safety. They knew the procedures for signaling distress, initiating an evacuation, and using the emergency beacon stored in the main cabin. The beacon had not been activated. The survival gear, including insulated sleeping bags, emergency rations, and flares, remained in storage. This suggested that whatever had compelled them to leave, it had happened quickly, without time to prepare. Interviews were conducted with the staff at the regional monitoring station in Whitehorse. The technician, who had received Maren Duclair's final transmission, reported nothing unusual about the communication. He stated that her tone was calm and professional, consistent with every other transmission he had logged from Station 37. He did note, however, that there had been a brief moment of silence near the end of the transmission, lasting perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, before Duclair concluded with her sign-off. He had not thought much of it at the time, attributing it to a momentary distraction or a pause to check instrumentation. When asked if he had heard any background sounds during the transmission, such as voices or movement, he stated that he had not. The only sound on the recording was Duclair's voice. The search continued for 12 days. Additional teams were brought in. Aerial surveys were conducted using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging equipment. Divers examined sections of the lake where the ice was thinner, checking for any indication that someone might have fallen through. No evidence was found. On March 7th, the official search was suspended. The case was reclassified from a rescue operation to a missing persons investigation. In the absence of evidence, theories emerged. Some were grounded in practical considerations, others ventured into speculation. None were ever proven. The first and most straightforward theory was that the researchers had ventured away from the station for a routine task, perhaps to retrieve equipment or investigate an anomaly in the surrounding area, and had become disoriented or injured. Hypothermia-induced confusion could have led them deeper into the forest, away from the relative safety of the station. This scenario was plausible, but it failed to account for several key details. All three individuals were experienced in northern wilderness environments. They had been trained to recognize the early signs of hypothermia and to avoid unnecessary exposure to extreme cold. Moreover, if they had left the station together for a task, it seemed unlikely that all three would have simultaneously abandoned standard safety protocols, including the use of radios, emergency beacons, and winter gear. The second theory suggested that a mechanical or environmental failure had forced a rapid evacuation. A fire, a carbon monoxide leak, or a structural collapse might have necessitated an immediate departure, leaving no time to gather supplies or signal for help. However, the station showed no evidence of fire damage, structural instability, or hazardous gas buildup. The generator had shut down normally, and there were no signs of malfunction in the heating or ventilation systems. This theory, while logical, could not be reconciled with the physical state of the station. A third possibility involved an encounter with wildlife. The northern forests were home to black bears, wolves, and other large predators. While attacks on humans were rare, they were not impossible, particularly in winter when food sources were scarce. If the researchers had been confronted by an animal, they might have fled without retrieving their gear. Yet this explanation, too, had significant weaknesses. There were no signs of animal activity near the station, no tracks, no blood, no torn clothing. Search teams had specifically looked for evidence of predation and found none. Another theory, one that gained traction among some members of the investigation team, was that one or more of the researchers had experienced a psychological breakdown brought on by isolation. The long winter, the monotony of the work, and the absence of social interaction could have led to paranoia, hallucinations, or irrational behavior. If one person had fled the station in a state of mental distress, the others might have followed in an attempt to bring them back. This scenario was supported by the ambiguous note found in the communications room. The phrase, "the trees are closer now," could be interpreted as evidence of perceptual distortion or delusional thinking. However, there was no prior documentation of psychological instability among the researchers. Maren Duclair, in particular, was noted for her emotional resilience and had completed multiple isolated assignments without incident. Some of the more speculative theories involved external actors. It was suggested that the researchers might have been abducted, either by individuals involved in illegal activity, such as smuggling or poaching, or by parties with an interest in disrupting the research program. However, the remoteness of the station made such scenarios unlikely. There were no nearby settlements, no evidence of human activity in the area, and no motive that could explain why someone would target a small meteorological outpost. A few individuals, including a retired geologist who had worked in the region during the 1960s, proposed that the disappearances were linked to unexplained geological or atmospheric phenomena. He noted that the area around Morel Basin had a history of unusual magnetic readings and localized weather anomalies. He speculated that the researchers might have encountered something they could not explain, something that compelled them to leave the station. This theory was dismissed by most investigators as unsubstantiated, though it persisted in informal discussions. One detail that continued to trouble those who studied the case was the condition of the station itself. The orderliness of the interior, the absence of any signs of panic, and the fact that the researchers had not activated the emergency beacon all suggested that their departure had been deliberate. Yet if it was deliberate, why had they not taken the supplies necessary for survival? And why had they not left a message explaining their actions? There was also the matter of the final transmission. Maren Duclair's words had been calm and routine, offering no hint that anything was wrong. But the brief silence noted by the technician in Whitehorse raised questions. Had she heard something during that pause? Seen something? Or was it simply a moment of distraction, insignificant and unrelated to what followed? Over the years, a few additional pieces of information surfaced, though none provided clarity. In the spring of 1981, a trapper working in the region claimed to have found a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, roughly 12 kilometers northwest of Station 37. The fabric was dark blue, consistent with the type of clothing issued to research personnel. He turned it over to authorities, but the fabric could not be definitively linked to any of the missing researchers. No other evidence was found in the area. In 1986, a family hiking in the vicinity of Morrell Basin reported seeing what they described as a weather station or research cabin near the southern edge of the lake. When they approached, they found the structure abandoned and overgrown with vegetation. They did not enter the building, but they noted that one of the windows appeared to have been broken from the inside, as if something had been pushed through it. By the time investigators returned to the site several weeks later, the window had been repaired, and there was no way to verify the family's account. The case of Maren Duclair, Leonard Goss, and Simone Archambault remains open. No bodies were ever recovered. No definitive explanation was ever established. There are questions that do not yield to investigation. There are disappearances that resist explanation. The case of Station 37 is one such disappearance. 3 people, trained and capable, vanished from a place they could not easily leave. They left behind a station that showed no signs of disturbance, no evidence of violence, and no indication that anything had gone wrong. Yet they were gone. Maren Duclair's final transmission remains one of the few concrete pieces of evidence in the case. Her voice, preserved on a recording that still exists, offers no clues. She speaks calmly. She reports routine data. She signs off in accordance with protocol. And then, 3 days later, she is gone. The silence that followed her final transmission has never been broken. The theories that emerged in the wake of the disappearances have been debated, dissected, and discarded. None of them account for all the facts. None of them provide the kind of closure that families and investigators seek. The northern wilderness is vast, indifferent, and unforgiving. It does not reveal its secrets willingly. The case remains open, not because there is hope of resolution, but because there is no evidence to close it, no bodies, no witnesses, no answers. In the decades since the disappearances, Station 37 has been reclaimed by the forest. The structure was dismantled and removed in the early 1980s, leaving only a clearing and a few concrete footings to mark where it once stood. The glacial lake, known as Morrell Basin, continues to freeze each winter and thaw each spring, unchanged and unconcerned. The trees that surround it grow taller, their shadows lengthening across the ice. There are those who believe the disappearances were the result of human error, a series of poor decisions that led to a tragic but explainable outcome. There are others who insist that something else was at work, something that cannot be easily categorized or understood. The truth, if it exists, lies somewhere in the frozen expanse of the Northern Territories, buried beneath snow and silence. Maren Duclair was 41 years old when she disappeared. Leonard Goss was 29.